Hello everyone, and welcome to today's Cambridge English Teacher webinar. I'm really pleased to welcome Laura Patsko as today's presenter. Laura is ELT Research Manager at Cambridge University Press and a former teacher and teacher trainer with a BA in Linguistics and an MA in ELT and Applied Linguistics. She's particularly interested in the use of English as a lingua franca, teaching pronunciation, and investigating the practical applications of linguistic research. She's editor of Speak Out, the newsletter of the IATEFL Pronsig, and she blogs and tweets, and we'll put the links for those into the chat. So, over to you, Laura.
Thank you, Alistair, for a very nice introduction. Hello, everybody. It's very nice to be with you on this partly sunny afternoon for me here in Cambridge. As Alistair said, I work here at Cambridge, but until recently I was a teacher and a teacher trainer. So I was in the classroom experiencing the joy and surprises of studying English every day, just like most of you are, I imagine. I completed my master's degree a couple of years ago, and I was focusing on pronunciation teaching for international understanding, the best possible international intelligibility. And that's what led me to this webinar today. It's been a long journey of discovery in research and in my own classroom practice, and I'm hoping that in this webinar you'll benefit from some of the things that I learned as much as I did when I was teaching. So, in the webinar we'll cover four main things. We're going to start with three very important questions which I think are important to ask and to try to answer before we start looking at practical ideas for teaching pronunciation. Then come the practical ideas. So we're going to look at a 5-step lesson plan. This is something I've shared a few times with different groups of teachers. I found it very helpful in my own teaching, and from feedback from the other teachers, it seems like it's quite a flexible lesson that people can choose to use with their own students to help them develop their abilities to listen to a wide variety of accents. So we're going to go through it again together and do a sort of demonstration so you can feel how the activities work. At the end, we will reflect on that process, and I'll suggest some more resources that you might find useful, both for examples of different accents of English and for further reading if you want to read more about the theory that informs all of these ideas. And at the very end, we'll have a question and answer session. I believe Alistair has already mentioned, but if you have questions during the webinar, just type them into the chat box, and Alistair or one of the other moderators will collect those questions so that we can look at them all together at the end of the webinar. At the end, I will also give some references to further reading. Sometimes in the webinar, I'll talk about research, so before you leave, you'll have a list of the references for that research. So you don't need to really quickly write everything down while you're listening. I will give you everything at the end. So let's start with the first three very important questions. Why? I think is possibly the best question that every effective learner has ever asked. And it drives their teachers crazy, but it's a really important question, and we're going to start with that. The simplest answer to this, from my view, is that intelligibility is a two-way street. When we're talking about clear pronunciation, we're not only talking about the way that one person produces particular sounds, we're also talking about how the listener interprets those sounds. Because without a listener, the speaker is just talking to themselves. And so really there needs to be an effort on both sides to understand and to be understood. I should say here that intelligibility is kind of a big, long word. I noticed that in the poll at the beginning of the webinar, a lot of you said that you were already quite confident with teaching pronunciation. So maybe you've already seen this term in the literature. There are different definitions of it, but for the purpose of this webinar, and for most of the purpose of what I write and speak about, I'm talking about your general understanding the words that somebody else said. They might mean something which you disagree with, but I'm just talking about the basic understanding. So if I say the word street, you understand this word street on the slide. Okay, you know what sounds I produced and what word I said. So essentially we're talking about both productive and receptive pronunciation skills when we talk about intelligibility. The speaker has a responsibility to make themselves understood, and the listener has a responsibility to try and understand, and it's that second group that we're going to look at in this webinar and how to develop those skills. There are very good reasons for developing intelligibility, obviously. When we talk about the use of English around the world, we start to notice that the group of people using English is getting bigger and bigger, and I noticed this particularly in my classrooms, looking at these two groups. BELF. I don't know if anybody has heard of BELF. You may have heard of ELF. ELF I'm defining as English as a lingua franca. So this is a very, very common use of English in the world today. It's where English is used as the common language between two speakers who don't share any other language. So if, for example, my first language is Arabic, and I'm speaking to someone whose first language is Japanese, and I don't speak Japanese and they don't speak Arabic, we might use English together. Now, that's English as a lingua franca, or ELF, but what is BELF? Well, BELF is business English as a lingua franca, and this is where I really became interested in my classroom in exploring this further, because so many of my students were learning English for work. They were using English in a business context, and they were using it with a very wide variety of speakers. So most of them weren't coming to my classroom because they wanted to move to the UK, where I'm based, or to another English-speaking country, but they were in my classroom because they lived in a non-English speaking country, but they worked in an English-speaking environment. And this is an increasingly common use of English, and one where there's a lot of potential for misunderstanding. There are so many different people involved with so many different first language backgrounds, and that's just the beginning. That's not starting with business people's egos and other industry agendas. Another reason why many of my students came to my school where I was working was for EMI, which some of you may know stands for English as a Medium of Instruction. So some of them were planning to study at university. Some of them wanted to study at university in the UK, and some of them wanted to study university in their country, but in both cases, they were often going to work on a course that was delivered in English. And so again, they were faced with a context where they had to do a lot of work to understand and be understood in any language. But adding a second language factor to that made them a little bit more nervous. It created new challenges. And time again, there was a problem with understanding. They either didn't feel confident that they could be understood by others, or they didn't feel confident that they would understand others. So these two groups are growing exponentially, and there is a lot of good indication that those groups will continue growing. So again, really important to learn to understand different accents, because there are so many speakers in those groups. And just one more thing, to borrow a phrase from Steve Jobs. The actual numbers involved in these growing groups that I keep talking about are really difficult to quantify, because of course, how do you define what is a speaker of a language? But some conservative estimates are that for every native speaker of English in the world, there are at least 3 non-native speakers. So again, our first important question of why learn how to understand different accents is because we just have to assume there will be a wide range of accents in any group of people using English together. So in the interest of intelligibility, we need to make an effort as listeners to understand this diversity, as we cannot assume that everybody will sound the same. That brings us to the second question, which is kind of related, but it's a question that I'm often asked when I do this kind of workshop or this kind of presentation is, well, why don't we just simplify things and focus on native speaker accents? That's what we've always done. Why change things now? And one phrase that often comes up in pronunciation teaching is comfortable intelligibility. But the question we need to ask now is, well, if we're telling our students to aim for comfortable intelligibility, comfortable to whom? Again, coming back to what I was just saying, the group of people using English is increasingly diverse. And if we only focus on producing and understanding native speaking accents of English, then we're not really preparing our students for the reality of the world. This is a often quoted statistic, which some of you may have come across, that of all the spoken interaction in English in the world, there's a 20-80 split. And you can probably guess now where I'm going with this. But the estimation is that approximately 20% of that involves native speakers. Which means that the overwhelming majority of spoken interaction in English in the world is actually between L2 users only, no native speakers present. And this statistic comes from 1991. So this is 24 years since this number was estimated. It's probably increased. In any case, it probably hasn't changed dramatically in terms of the balance, there being more interaction involving people using English as a second language. So again, why not just focus on native speaker accents of English? Well, because we just can't assume that the person listening to a user of English will be a native speaker or have the same expectations. And similarly, we cannot pretend that our students will only encounter British or American accents or want to sound that way, which is what most of the materials and practice in the ELT industry have done for so many years. And then our last question. Well, that's all well and good, but don't you think this kind of analysis is just a little bit too hard for learners? Well, if I thought that, I wouldn't be spending an hour doing a webinar, so I hope you'll agree with me that it's not hard at all. It's actually quite a simple formula. It's a question of exposure and attention. It sounds a little overwhelming, but as we're probably all aware, when you have more exposure to something, when you are very familiar with it, you feel more comfortable with it, and it feels less scary. The thing is that exposure alone is not enough. If I simply sit in a room and listen to someone playing a guitar, I might be more familiar with the sound of the music, but it won't teach me how to play the guitar. I also need to pay attention. I need to focus my attention and develop specific micro skills. And it's the same for pronunciation, whether we're talking about productive skills or receptive skills. We do this all the time in our first language or in other languages that we're comfortable with without even thinking. One example, and the example we're focusing on in this webinar, is recognizing regional accents. When we know a language well, we're able to automatically detect differences, and we recognize the regularity of those differences, and then we reset in our brain the parameters. We reset our expectations of what we're going to hear. So for example, I often give this example of a particular quantity of water. And if I say liter, that's very careful speech in my native accent. Okay? If I say liter, that would sound like a different accent. If I say liter, that's my natural accent. If I say liter, you hear a different accent. And I've said the same word every time, but each time you hear it, you're effectively hearing someone else's voice. You're hearing a different accent, and you're recognizing it immediately because you're familiar with the groups of people that usually pronounce that word in that way. You have a kind of switch in your head, and you can flick the switch and say, ah, okay, she said liter. She might be from London or from the south of England, for example, where that pronunciation is common. Or I say liter. And you flick that switch and you say, oh, okay, maybe she's American or Canadian, or maybe she's studied that variety of English. So the point is that you do this all the time without thinking when you are already familiar with an accent, and we just need to train our students to have this same familiarity. I think the important thing to remember here as well, if you're trying not to feel like this is too difficult or too overwhelming, is to be systematic, because accents are systematic. They're not merely mistaken speech. This is a quotation from a resource which I'll share with you at the end, which features it's a bank of a wide variety of different recordings of different accents in English. And I thought this was a very nice way of explaining why accent is different than just saying, oh, they said it wrong, or that doesn't sound right to me. That's not how I would say it. But the point is that with a particular accent, especially a regional accent, they're systematic, they're regular, they're predictable. I know that every time I say liter, one of my friends might say liter, because we come from different places and that's the way that we represent that word in our individual speech. So what you're trying to do is take a systematic approach to a systematic process. And there you can help your students improve their receptive pronunciation skills. So now we come to our 5-step lesson plan to develop better receptive pronunciation skills. And I'm calling them receptive pronunciation skills rather than listening skills to make a distinction between listening generally, just getting someone's general message, and really focusing on individual words, being intelligible, being clear. And to me, that's an aspect of pronunciation, but it's the receptive side of pronunciation. It's making sense of the sound signals that we receive from someone else and processing that so that we recognize the words they are saying. I'll tell you the 5 steps. Each step is important for different reasons, which I'll summarize at the end. Rather than explaining all the reasons now, we're going to do the 5 steps together so that you can feel how students might feel if you're doing a lesson using these 5 steps. So the first step is to listen, very generally, as I say, a little bit different than receptive pronunciation. You start with the big picture, just listen. Then you need to notice. You're going to notice particular things in what you just listened to. Then you analyze. You go from the macro level to the micro level, looking very closely at particular aspects of the speaker. Then you practice, which means making new predictions based on the analysis you've just done. And you finish reflecting on the whole process, how you did it, if it was useful, why it was useful, how you could do it in a different way, and so on. So let's start with listening. This question, what advice would you give someone who is learning English for their current or future job? I've asked this question to a number of different people, and I've recorded what they said, how they answered. I asked the question to business people, focusing on BELF, particularly, the business English as a lingua franca. So these are people who are using English for work with a wide range of speakers of English from all over the world, first language and second language users. I'm going to play you a recording of somebody answering that question, but first, based on what we've looked at in the beginning of the webinar, I'd like you to enter your own ideas in the chat box. So before we listen to this recording, how would you answer this question based on everything that we've just talked about? I'll give you maybe about 2 or 3 minutes to share your ideas. I won't speak during this time, so there will be some silence, but just type your answers into the chat box and I'll be reading them and thinking about them. And if there's something particularly important, I'll address that before we continue. So if you can use the chat box now to answer that question in your own words.
Okay, so there's some interesting answers coming in very quickly already. That's great. Okay, we'll be reading all these and keeping up with them. Okay, so keep those coming in, and we'll be playing the recording itself in a moment or two.
Okay, thank you, everybody. I'm really impressed and surprised by the number of fantastic ideas that I'm seeing in the chat box. I'm going to ask you to stop now sending in all your ideas because I need you to focus your attention on our recording. So just remember this question. We're going to play a recording of Laura. Here is Laura. She comes from Madrid in Spain. She works as a manager for a major international company. The recording is about 1 minute long, and all I want you to do while you watch the recording is listen to how she answers this question, okay? Do not worry about her pronunciation. Don't think about that now. Just listen to her message. What is her opinion? What is her idea? What advice would she give someone who's learning English for their current or their future job? Okay, I hope you're ready. Here she comes.
I will say, well, if they are able to be exposed to a real environment, and meaning not just British or native speakers, it's just that people who actually, they're able, or they've got a intermediate, they're able to speak, to have a conversation. It doesn't matter the accent, the origin, nothing, because that's another problem. Because the way we learn English usually is based on this standard English that is not real, because all of us, we come from different countries. In my department here, for example, I need to communicate, work with people from the Netherlands, people from Greece, from Turkey, different people, British people, American people, Irish. The important thing is to make sure your ear gets used to the different sounds. And of course, you've been able to talk and talk and talk, because it's the best way.
Okay, that's the end of Laura's video. I would invite my students at this stage normally to share their ideas. As with a typical listening lesson, I would play the recording, let them listen, and then ask them what they heard. Because there are over 100 of you in the chat box at the moment, I'm going to take the simpler approach, and I hope that you agree with me, that you understand that her general advice is to get exposure to a real environment, which she means including a wide variety of speakers from different places in the world, native speakers and non-native speakers, but to start getting practice in that environment and not be afraid to speak. So I hope that that's what you understood as well. The next step that I would do in a listening skills lesson with my students, and you probably take a similar approach typically in our training, is to listen for more detail. So I'm going to play the clip again. This time I want you to listen for one particular point, one particular thing that she mentions. In her opinion, what is the problem with the way English is usually taught?
I will say,
in her opinion,
I will say,
excuse me. So the question is, in Laura's opinion, what is the problem with the way English is usually taught?
I will say, well, if they are able to be exposed to a real environment, and meaning not just British or native speakers, it's just that people who actually, they're able, or they've got a intermediate, they're able to speak, to have a conversation. It doesn't matter the accent, the origin, nothing, because that's another problem. Because the way we learn English usually is based on this standard English that is not real, because all of us, we come from different countries. In my department here, for example, I need to communicate, work with people from the Netherlands, people from Greece, from Turkey, different people, British people, American people, Irish. The important thing is to make sure your ear gets used to the different sounds. And of course, you've been able to talk and talk and talk, because it's the best way.
Okay, Okay, thank you. We're going to move that video now. Excuse us, the slides have disappeared, but they will come back. Just to explain that again, normally at this point in the lesson, I would encourage my students to share their ideas of what they heard. We would reflect on the answer to the detailed question. And I hope that you understood the same as I understood, which is that she feels get the same exposure as you get in a real environment. So in her opinion, that is the problem with the way English is normally taught. That brings us to the second stage of the 5-step lesson plan, which is noticing. So what I would do at this point is give the students 2 or 3 words or phrases from the recording to notice. Again, they're not thinking about particular pronunciation now. All they're doing is indicating when they hear these phrases in the clip. If I was doing this in a classroom, I would give them the words on a piece of paper, and I would ask them to just tick the word when they hear it. Or I could give them the words on different pieces of paper, and when they hear a word, they have to grab the piece of paper, they have to pick it up. Or if I had no paper, I could ask them to raise their hand when they hear the word. Now, because we're doing this in a webinar context, we're going to try something a little bit different. I would like you to indicate when you hear these 2 words, this one and this one. And we're going to do this by using a poll. You did a poll at the beginning of the webinar where you answered a question. This time, with Alistair's help, we're going to have 2 polls, one which represents the first word, one which represents the second word. And you just need to hold your mouse ready over the yes button. Alistair, if you can move the polls now so people can see. Okay, so there's the poll for the first word. Don't press yes yet. Okay, don't press anything yet. Please wait. Just press no vote. Okay, so don't vote yet. Okay. We're going to play the clip of Laura. If you hold your mouse ready, when you hear the word in the first poll, click yes. Not before, but when you hear it. So this is, by analogy, how I would do it in the classroom. I would tell my students, when you hear the first word, raise your hand. But because we're using a webinar, I'm going to ask you to use a poll instead. So when you hear the first word, click yes. And the same, when you hear the second word, click yes. I hope you're ready. I'm going to play the video now.
I will say, well, one of the, if they are able to be exposed to a real environment, and meaning not just British or native speakers, it's just that people who actually, they're able, or they've got a intermediate, they're able to speak, to have a conversation.
Wow. Excellent. Fantastic work. That was an experiment and you all performed very well. So you can see that, or can you see, Alistair, can they see the polls? So you should be able to see the results of the poll now, that most of you heard that word and you clicked yes. When you did that, I saw the yes votes multiply hugely immediately. And the equivalent in your classroom is that you will see that your students have understood when she said these words. And this is really, really important because in a moment we're going to look at her pronunciation, and a really common complaint of students is, oh, I just don't understand speakers from this group. I don't understand their accent. But often that's not true. There's something which they don't understand, there's something which they find difficult, but in reality, when they hear these words, they do understand them, they recognize them. So this is quite an important stage for confidence building early. It demonstrates, like you just did, that they don't have a problem understanding her speech. And she does have a Spanish accent. So this is quite an important early message. Now, if we can come back to the main slide, we'll move on to step 3, and then we'll listen to Laura again. So, step 3, you may remember, is to analyze. You can do this in different ways, but what you're trying to do is draw your students' attention to a particular feature of pronunciation which those words or phrases demonstrate. Now, you already know this feature because you've planned the lesson and you've chosen these words. But at this point, the students don't have any idea what you're thinking about. They just see 2 English words. They don't know that you're going to focus on a specific pronunciation element. So you have it in your mind, but you need to lead them slowly, comfortably, to discover. So I'm going to ask you to do this analysis. Again, I want you to use the chat box. And I want you to decide which sound, just one sound, one phoneme, these 2 words have in common. Okay, only one sound. Now, I know that you won't be able to type in phonemic script, so just do your best to show which sound you mean. I'm going to give you about 1 minute. Okay, which one sound do these 2 words have in common? Type your ideas in the chat box, please. Okay, perfect, guys. I won't give you a full minute because you all found it, and I would hope so, as you're all language experts. But you'd be surprised. Your students might need a little bit of time to do this kind of analysis. That doesn't matter. Give them time. They're learning. They're not performing. But just be prepared that they might need a little while to think about it, to reflect, and make sure they say the words aloud. Get them to say the sounds and play with them and listen to them. You can't do this kind of analysis only in your head. So as you have all discovered and agreed, the sound they have in common is shh. The reason I've chosen this sound for this clip, and again, as the teacher, I know this at this stage, but the students don't know this. The reason I've chosen this sound is because this is a sound which commonly occurs in Spanish accented English in a way which people might not expect if they're not accustomed, if they're not familiar with listening to Spanish accented English. So what I do at this stage is I ask my students how would they say these words. Okay? I just ask them to compare. They're not judging, they're not correcting, they're not evaluating, they're just comparing. They have to say the words themselves and think, how would I say this? Okay? I'm going to trust you to do that alone. So if you can entertain yourself alone for 10 seconds in front of your computer and just say these words to yourself. Say them out loud. Listen to them. I'll give you 10 seconds. Okay, I hope that's enough time. Now we're going to bring Laura back, the same clip, so you already heard this clip. Okay, it's the beginning of her interview, and I want you to notice how she says these sounds. So now you're listening for these same 2 words, and now you're focusing on her pronunciation. Here we go.
I will say, well, one of the if they are able to be exposed to a real environment, and meaning not just British or native speakers, it's just that people who actually they're able, or they've got a intermediate, they're able to speak, to have a conversation.
Okay, I'm going to play the clip again. I would do this for my students as well. I would play the clip at least 2 times, give them a chance to hear the sounds clearly. So I'll play it again. Remember, you're listening for the same 2 words.
I will say, well, one of the if they are able to be exposed to a real environment, and meaning not just British or native speakers, it's just that people who actually they're able, or they've got a intermediate, they're able to speak, to have a conversation.
Okay. I won't play the clip again, but in the classroom I might let the students listen again. It depends on their level and their ability to perceive these things quickly. I hope that you'll have heard that in at least one case, she says a sound which is a little bit more like this in these places. It's not always easy to hear. It's a very small difference, but it's the kind of difference that listeners who are not used to a Spanish accented English user, they might not expect this difference, and it might confuse them or just surprise them. And that surprise might be enough to make them lose their concentration or be unsure what's happening. Now, this is something that I know as the teacher before I've come to the class. I've done my analysis, I've looked in the literature, and I've found that for some speakers of Spanish, this sh sound is not common in their pronunciation. It's something they may have to learn, something they may have to practice, and sometimes it may be replaced by a sound which is more like s. Okay? I'm being very tentative in my explanation here because, of course, it's not as simple as saying, oh, they don't say sh, they say s. It's never that simple. But for your students, you can afford to simplify. What you're trying to do is just draw their attention to patterns. Because you remember that I talked about having a switch in your head, and this switch is something you can flick when you recognize a different accent, and you can reset your expectations of what you're listening to so that you don't have any trouble understanding. And so what you're doing at this point is resetting your parameters. You're creating a switch. And we're going to call this the Spanish switch. And the important thing to do now is to flick on that Spanish switch, because we're going to listen to Laura again, and now you're more prepared to hear what she says and to process the sounds that she's making, because you have a new parameter. You've rewired your switch. So this brings us to stage 4. This is the practicing, or the predicting. I'm going to show you 2 more phrases from the second part of the clip, and I want you to think, where might you hear sh? And what other sound might you hear? Okay, so you've switched on your Spanish switch. These are the 2 phrases. And now we have the video of Laura, the second part of her interview. So just listen and decide what you hear.
It doesn't matter the accent, the origin, nothing, because that's another problem. Because the way we learn English usually is based on this standard English that is not real. Because all of us, we come from different countries. In my department here, for example, I need to communicate, work with people from the Netherlands, people from Greece, from Turkey, different people, British people, American people, Irish. The important thing is to make sure your ear gets used to the different sounds.
Okay, and I'm going to play the clip one more time. Again, you're listening to how she says those phrases, and you're comparing her pronunciation with your new expectations.
It doesn't matter the accent, the origin, nothing, because that's another problem. Because the way we learn English usually is based on this standard English that is not real. Because all of us, we come from different countries. In my department here, for example, I need to communicate, work with people from the Netherlands, people from Greece, from Turkey, different people, British people, American people, Irish. The important thing is to make sure your ear gets used to the different sounds.
Okay, so we're going to say goodbye to Laura now. And again, at this point in a lesson with my students, I would have asked them earlier, what are your predictions? And after the video, I can ask them, did your predictions match what she said in the video? So again, you're just comparing. You're not evaluating, you're not judging, you're not correcting. You're simply comparing. How is this person's speech different to mine? Because it's very easy to expect to hear the same things that you yourself would say. And this is where our students will have difficulty, is if the phonological representation in their head doesn't match someone else's speech. Now I'm going to skip the thorough feedback that I would normally do with my students. Again, because of the webinar format, and there's so many of you, this would be a little bit complicated. But I hope that you've heard this, that during the clip, she said a sound which was very close to sh in the words sure and conversation. And in the phrases standard English and British, her pronunciation was a little bit closer to s. Now, maybe at this point you're thinking or you're worrying that earlier I said accents are systematic, they're consistent. And it's true that generally they are, and it's quite important to train your students to be consistent in what they produce. But in reality, this doesn't always happen, and so I think instead of pretending how we might like English to be, wouldn't it be easier if it was clearer, more consistent, and so on, we need to be realistic that there will be some alternation. We just need to prepare ourselves for that. So really, we need to train our students to listen flexibly. At this stage, that's quite a lot of processing for the students to do. Now, you and I are experienced teachers. We enjoy teaching, I hope. We enjoy studying and analyzing pronunciation, but that's a lot of information for our students to deal with. That's quite enough for one lesson. So at the end, it's really important not to just give them more and more immediately, but to give them a chance to reflect. And I would suggest at this point that they reflect on why this kind of process is important. Was it easy? Was it difficult? Could they use this process with people that they speak with in real life? What other speakers do they know from this first language background, and etc. I would say in this webinar, we're going to reflect, but we're going to do a teacher's version, since you're teachers and not students. And I'm going to ask you 3 questions, and I'm going to give you about 3 minutes just to type your ideas into the chat box. It's just a chance for you to share your reflections. If you prefer to reflect by yourself and just think for a moment, that's fine too. But if you want to talk about it and share it with the other people in the webinar, then please use the chat box. And I'll do my best to follow, and we'll save any really key questions for the questions and answers in a moment. So here
Hi, we're just, there's no sound for the moment just because you're meant to be reflecting on and answering these questions. So as Laura said, if you can just think about these questions and maybe type your answers into the chat for a moment. Thanks very much.
questions. Okay, thank you everybody. I'm going to stop you there. There's a lot of information here to reflect on, and I really hope that after the webinar you will continue reflecting, particularly if you try this kind of activity with your students. It's really important to sit down afterwards and think about how it went, and to discuss that with them as well. We're going to finish now just with a summary of the key points, and then we'll have some time for questions and answers. So we've talked about there being 5 stages. First, listening. It's really, really important to do this first because you must establish context and interest in the clip. You need a general understanding before you start looking at particular sounds, because when you're looking at particular sounds or particular aspects of pronunciation, you don't want your students to be generally having trouble with the message and the meaning. You don't want them to be preoccupied with issues like, but what does she mean, or I don't understand this concept. You want them to only focus on the sound. So start by listening to what they said before you begin listening to how they said it. Then you need them to notice particular words, particular phrases which demonstrate the pronunciation feature you're going to look at. And I mentioned this earlier, but this is really important to show the learners that they could understand the speaker. It encourages confidence in them and confidence in the person that they're listening to. Then comes the analysis. I said at the beginning that exposure is not enough. So here you need to focus the learner's attention on one particular thing. And then you put the theory into action, okay? You practice, you predict, you flick on that switch. And then reflect. Don't let them leave without realizing what they've just achieved. This is really difficult, and it takes time to develop these kinds of skills. So encourage them to reflect on why they're so useful and how they're developing those skills. I have to say, I know I'm a little bit obsessed with this switch analogy, but I really like it because I found that learners would come to me later after doing work like this. They'd have left the class, they'd have gone away, and they'd heard somebody speak with a particular accent we'd been studying. And they'd say, "Teacher, I can't believe it. I heard someone speaking after our lesson, and I understood it immediately. It's like magic." And I feel like this fits very nicely with the switch analogy because there's a kind of light bulb moment. And they so rarely get these light bulb moments, especially when they get to higher levels and they already feel like they know quite a lot. So again, don't let them go without reflecting on what they've learned and encourage them to keep doing it. A few things to remember, which I want to leave you with before we go to the questions and answers. It's really important to analyze and not to patronize, not to mock. When you bring a range of accents into your classroom, you're bringing a range of identities into your classroom, and that's a really sensitive thing. So you want to always keep the analysis somewhat academic and objective. You're not laughing at other people's pronunciation or singling it out as somehow problematic. You're really just analyzing. You're doing ear training. And related to that, this takes time. So don't expect miracles overnight, but equally don't give up too easily. It can be a really rewarding process, and it's really important. It's also important to make this a habit. Bring a range of voices into class just as a matter of course, so that it doesn't become an unusual difference and start to stand out. Of course, as we saw at the beginning, a wide range of accents in English is not unusual. That's the reality of English in the world now. So people learning English and trying to use it in an international context, such as business or study, they need to be prepared to hear a range of voices. Ideally, your first choice then should have a human speaker for them to listen to. In the absence of a real live person who represents a particular accent, use video. You notice I used video in this webinar, even though we were just listening, because a big part of pronunciation is being able to hear, to see the speaker's mouth, to see their face. As a last resort, just use audio. That said, be careful with poor quality videos. There are a lot of videos out there, and they're not all very good quality. Some good examples on YouTube are of second language using celebrities, and they can also make good role models for your students as examples of people who've been through similar learning processes as them, and maybe from the same first language background. And finally, share what you've learned. It takes time to develop these kinds of resources. I've created a website with a colleague of mine who's based in Thailand. This is the website. We call it ELF-PRON. This is an example of where you can share the things that you've learned and the resources. This is why we created the website when we were teaching. We started this blog so that we could share with people what we were making, because we felt that there needed to be more resources like this. So if you do the same, please do share it with us. You can also find recordings of speakers from around the world at these website addresses. I've spoken to Alistair and he said that these links will be available in the chat box, and you can also see the links on the slides in the recording afterwards. So we're going to move on now and finish with any questions that you might have. And I'd like to thank you all for your attention and your eager participation. It's been really enjoyable for me. So let's take some questions.
Okay, so we've got slightly shorter questions, but first one, why can't we just focus on received pronunciation, which can be easily understood by everyone around the world? That's from Lakshman Sokolingam.
That's a really important question, and I'm glad that somebody spoke about it. Received pronunciation is often used as a standard in materials, but in fact it's spoken by a very small percentage of people around the world. One estimate a few years ago was that fewer than 3% of people, of speakers in Britain, where the accent originated, actually use it. There's also been a lot of research into which accents are more or less intelligible, and the short answer is that there is no one accent which is inherently most intelligible. What makes an accent clear is a listener's familiarity with it. There's a lot of research to support this. So I have to say that I don't feel RP or any other one accent is ever the solution. There will always be a need to listen to a range.
Thanks. Next question from Alessandra Cabral, who says, do you believe students must practice to have something similar to a specific accent, perhaps one that they're often in contact with?
That's also a very good question. I think students do need to practice to make their pronunciation intelligible. I don't think they need to practice using a specific accent. If they want to, then that should be determined by discussion with the teacher, and you can work towards that goal. From my perspective, the important thing is to be understood, is to be intelligible. There is some research by somebody called Jennifer Jenkins. She created a list of priorities called the lingua franca core, and that gives you a good idea of where to start when you're identifying which aspects of pronunciation would help the speaker be intelligible. So if they're happy to speak with an accent which reflects their first language, but they also want to be clearly understood, they can focus on the features in the lingua franca core. And we've got a lot of information and advice about that on the ELF-PRON website, so I suggest you read about it there.
Okay, and just very quick. One final question. How much time would you give to activities like this during a lesson?
If you're doing a lesson on listening, I think you could incorporate this towards the end of the lesson. It's really difficult to state a specific length of time because, of course, every class is different and all students are different. But you can see that we've just spent an hour discussing it and doing it for the first time. So really, you can spend considerable time doing this kind of analysis, and I would not try to do it in anything less than 30 minutes. I'm afraid because of timing, we're probably going to have to stop the questions there, but I would be very happy to answer any questions that you want to share. I believe that Alistair has shared my Twitter account, or we can share it in the chat box now. So if you'd like to ask any more questions directly, you can. Or if you go to the ELF-PRON website, there's also a page called Meet and Contact Us, and you can send your questions there as well, and we'd be happy to respond. And thank you very much again for your attention and your participation.
Okay, so thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Laura, and we'll be back in 2 weeks' time when we've got a webinar with Nick Bilborough, who'll be talking about organising writing in the classroom, and you can sign up for that on our webinars page. The recording of today's webinar should be live in our resources section next week, and you should all receive an emailed certificate of attendance for today's webinar within the next week or so. So thank you very much. Thanks, everybody, and thank you particularly, Laura, for a really interesting session. Okay, bye, everybody.